you completed the challenge that I gave you last time, putting your level together, making everything into prefabs, you should have something that looks kind of like this in your hierarchy. If you didn't, or if you got confused, here's how you do it. The things that I told you to make sure that you prefabbed were the paddle, the ball, the goal, and you'd already done the block along with me. But to turn something into a prefab, you can tell I've already done that because these are blue, but if I hadn't, I would click it and drag it down into the prefabs folder, and that turns something into a prefab. Something I forgot to tell you that is kind of neat with prefabs and something that makes them a lot more flexible to work with is that anything that hasn't been changed on these prefabs that you've already put into the scene and the ones down here in your prefabs folder. So for example, how I showed you guys that you can change the colors, which is why I have these gray blocks. So this block right here and these three other yellow blocks will always follow along in color whenever I change the color of this block because everything is like the colors are still the same. So basically what I'm trying to get at is that, like, say down here I decide that all the yellow ones need to be a different color. I could change them from over here. And because the prefab's inserted into the scene, the color matches what this one is. These yellow ones will change. The gray ones will stay the same because they have already been changed from what the prefab color is, so they will constantly remain unique. That's a pretty neat thing with prefabs, and it's something that you might find useful whenever you're making your game. Maybe you change your color theming a little bit and you want to make some tweaks. That's how you do it. So now that everything is a prefab, I'm going to get rid of that. Now that everything is a prefab, we need to add some things to our game to make it so that our game has some collisions and some physics and all of that jazz. So like right now, if I hit play and my computer thinks about it, nothing happens, right? Everything just sits there. It's not being told to do anything. It's just I made a pretty picture. So what I need to do is I need to add some components to my sprites. Now notice I am changing them from down here in the prefab so that they will apply to everything up here. That way I don't have to change it up here and then click apply to go back to the prefab because I don't want that. I want it to just start out being on there. So for each of our different sprites, we need to add two components. We need to add a rigid body and we need to add some colliders. Actually, we only need a rigid body, I believe, on our ball. We'll talk about that more in a second. So here's how you add a component. You might recall from way back in the day that you could add a script this way. It's not my preferred method because I think it's messy and you have to drag your script into your script folder and it seems like an extra step you don't need to do. But this is a very powerful tool for adding your components. It keeps everything just based on what you've most recently searched, and you can find things really easily. So let's go ahead and look for rigid body. There's two options here. There's rigid body and rigid body 2D. We are working in 2D right now, so this is the one we want. If we were in a 3D game, we would want the regular rigid body. So rigid body 2D. So real quick, just as an experiment, let's take this ball in the scene. We'll move it up here and play the game and see what happens now that I have this on here. Now it falls, and it falls into infinity because there was nothing for it to run into, but gravity now affects this ball. So let's go ahead and see what happens when the paddle, we're going to put a collider on the paddle, which basically just means it's like kind of like a fence around our sprite that tells everything else that encounters it that this is something that you should run into and not be able to go through, or there are other reasons, but basically it's a fence around it. So we have a square sprite here, so a box collider would be appropriate, obviously 2D because we don't need a 3D box. In the instance that we had a shape that was more complex, we could use a Polygon Collider and change it based on that shape. But right now, let's do a box collider. So now our paddle has two components that aren't just the transform. It's got the sprite and it's got the box collider. So now when I run my game, nope, never mind. It ran right past it. So let's see. Let's look at this box collider on the paddle and see what's going on here. Let's edit our collider. Paddle, box collider, edit collider. All right, we've got this. Should be good. Maybe should tell it that it's something to run into. Oh, you know what? Our ball doesn't have a box or have a collider on it. So it would tell any other colliders it runs into that it needs to stop, but it's not going to tell the circle. So we need a circle collider on here. You can see this green outline here is the collider on the circle. Now let's see what happens. Now it goes dink and it falls and it hits this and it doesn't roll off because this is a perfectly flat surface. Perfect. So basically the rigid body controls how this will interact with the world, and this one is the collider that tells it that this is the fence around this object. It's a little bit confusing maybe, but I'm sure that you will you'll get the hang of it pretty quickly. So our blocks also need colliders, right? Because we need to make sure that we aren't just running straight through our blocks. So our yellow blocks have it. Do our gray blocks have it? Our gray blocks have it because the prefab that we changed was this one down here and not the ones up here, so we're good there. And our goal, now we're going to do something slightly different with our goal. Here's how we're going to deal with this. So I've put a circle collider on the goal. Now when I click it, it's obviously very, very wrong. So we need to edit it a little bit. And because it's a circle collider, it's actually not going to be exactly what we want. So never mind. Let's try. Let's go ahead and delete this component because we don't need it. Right click and remove component. Let's do, let's go ahead and try out a Polygon Collider. Okay, so if we put a Polygon Collider on here, it kind of looks very messy, but I think we should be good. Goal, Polygon Collider, let's edit it and see what this looks like. So this is the space around it. Yeah, okay, so this is pretty good. That's what the Polygon Collider is going to look like for now. Click off of Edit Collider here. So our goal, we don't want to actually hit the goal. What we actually want to do with the goal is we want to make it so that whenever we pass through the fence, it creates a moment where the code can say, oh, okay, so we passed through it, we need to do a thing. And how we do that is on the collider, there's a bunch of options here. And one is trigger. Is trigger is basically, it should look a little bit familiar from the very beginning when we talked about what a bool type of variable is. Basically, a bool is anything that is either true or false. So this is Unity's built-in bool for whether or not a collider is a trigger. So if we check yes, it means that our objects will be able to pass through it, but when that happens, this will this will send a message to our script that we will use to tell it to do whatever we want it to do. So say, for example, we want it to go to the next level. So that's how that works. And because I changed it, you'll notice I did this up here on my hierarchy goal, and I didn't do it on my prefab goal. So this is now bolded because it hasn't been applied back to the prefab. So I'm just going to click apply, and now whenever I check over here, my prefab one has it checked too. So always make sure that you are, if you're not changing it down here, if you're changing it up in the hierarchy, you always want to double check that everything is applied. And Unity's way of hinting at that is whenever stuff is bolded. Now, in Transform, you can ignore the bolded stuff because usually your prefabs are going to move around. Like, for example, our paddle is going to constantly be moving. Our blocks whenever we place them, we don't want to place them all right on top of each other, but we do want them to be prefabs. So the position is always going to be bolded because we're going to be moving them around. But if there's something in the sprite renderer, or like say you've changed the color and you want to apply that back to the prefab, and you're wondering why it's not working, but color is bolded, that's when your hint that you need to hit apply to send it back to the prefab. I know it's a little bit like of a complex idea, but it's basically kind of like this is where everything gets copied and pasted from, and you make a change, you want to make sure that you're copying and pasting the changed thing and not the original unaltered version. And we're going to go ahead and make a new folder real quick in our assets. We're going to right click on assets and create a folder. We're going to call this one materials. I'm not going to underscore this one because I don't necessarily need it to be at the top. I'm hardly going to interact with it. Right click on materials, and over here we need to find something. Now if I can figure out where it is, we need to add a material. And nope, never mind, that's not the right one. Delete that. You're a 3D material. You're not what I want. Create, let's see. Ah, here it is. Down at the bottom part of my menu. I just didn't read it properly. Physics material 2D. This is what we need to make to give our ball some interesting physics. And even the picture is kind of a perfect example of why we're applying this to our ball. So we're going to call this ball material because we like to be very, very descriptive. And up here on our prefab, where we find our ball, we have space for a material on our Rigidbody 2D. So let's go ahead and apply this. You see it says physics material, and we're adding a physics material to this. Let's see what happens whenever we run our game now. It bounced just a tiny, tiny bit, but not a lot. So let's add some bounciness. Let's add 5 bouncy and see what that looks like. It might be a little bit crazy, but let's see what it does. Bong, and it went so fast it flew off of the screen. So definitely way too much. Let's try 1 bouncy and see what that looks like. A lot of game design is just testing and testing and retesting and seeing what it looks like. Now, it's going to just keep bouncing infinitely because right now it's just every time gaining just a tiny bit more velocity and bouncing just a little bit higher, because we have a little bit of gravity applied to our scene because of our Rigidbody, which we could turn off, and we'll talk more about that later. But now it's going to bounce back and forth between these two, and it's going to slowly go faster and faster. So now our ball has bounciness. It means basically that our ball, whenever it encounters a collider, will bounce off of whatever collider it has encountered. So we applied that right here to the Rigidbody 2D. And there's also a couple of other things here that we're not going to mess with just yet, but later on, whenever you want to make your game more unique, you may want to know about this stuff. Basically, you can turn your gravity up, which means that you would kind of counteract your bounciness by having the ball basically be heavier and not, quite so buoyant. Is that the word? Buoyant. And linear drag, meaning like whenever it goes in a certain direction over time, the drag, meaning like the force of air on it, quote unquote air, I suppose, would slow it down, things like that. So that's information that you can do there. But this right here, you can also turn up the friction, which basically means every time it encounters an object, it'll slow it down by 0.4 friction. It's up to you. Find the bounciness that you like and go ahead and set yours to that. I like mine at 1 for now. I think that that's fine. I might turn it up later. I might not. I might turn it down. Who knows? But for now, you have something that's actually starting to look like a game, right? So you can't actually interact with it yet, but you have something that moves. You have some physics being applied to it. You have objects that have barriers around them that it knows how to interact with automatically. And we've set our goal as a trigger so that we can use that later on to tell our game what to do. So make sure you save up, and you can go ahead and play around with your settings a little bit to decide how you want to best set everything up. Make sure that your ball has a Rigidbody 2D with the 2D physics material attached to it. You need to make sure that your ball has, or your block has a box collider attached to it. Your goal needs to have a Polygon Collider in my case. Maybe you made your goal a different shape. That's up to you. But mine has a Polygon Collider, and it fits nicely to the surface. And it is set as is trigger is checkmarked. Make sure that you changed that on your prefab. And your paddle needs to have a box collider as well. So with all of that done, you are ready to take some steps forward, and we're going to try and figure out how to make our paddle follow our cursor and make it so that this is kind of a playable game where our ball will bounce off of our paddle and be able to make it around the screen.